Hello, this is Dr. McClellan, and this video is in the Constitution unit because it gives you a greater idea, a broader idea of the Constitution. One, how it works, and two, how it's been ignored or abused, and what happened, whether even if nothing happened, but what happened. And there's two examples because one is the first time and one is the most recent, and so it shows you the precedent because that's important. Let me explain. Precedent in the law is important because if one person goes out and let's say one person goes out, walks into a Walmart and starts shooting people and gets away with it, doesn't go to jail, doesn't go to prison, then that sets up what in legal terms is called a precedent, which means that anybody can now walk into a Walmart, shoot people, kill people, and then their lawyer can argue, well, Your Honor, this guy got off. So there's precedent, and we need to be very careful as American citizens what we allow to happen in a constitutional crisis because that sets up precedent. So I'll talk more about that as we go along. This is a really long video. I don't suggest that you try to watch it all at one time. There will be some information about this, so you will, well, I don't say information because you know me, I'm not a one and done kind of teacher, but this will, an overall knowledge of this. You need to have an overall knowledge of what's on the screen. And I'll put my handout, I'll add my handout to it so that you can go in and I'll put it on as a DOCX so that you can go in and open it and add your own comments to it if you want to use it as a study guide. And so there will be an essay question about constitutional crises and precedent and why it's important on the exam one. Okay, so let's get into it. Sorry. So these are our current constitutional crises in the United States. The Constitution doesn't automatically stop constitutional crises. I mean, if we didn't have a Constitution, we wouldn't have constitutional crises, so it kind of causes them. But it does provide the rules and the tools to stop or deal with constitutional crises. But it's people and institutions who decide not only if those rules are followed, but how they're followed. And the founding fathers, the framers, were very aware that there was going to be friction in government. There's always going to be friction in governing. There has to be. That was their viewpoint. There has to be friction in governing. And I have to say, I'm going to inject my opinion in here. I agree. I agree with that because if the president is doing something that he shouldn't be doing and Congress is trying to stop him, that's friction. And that's Congress's job. And if the president and the Congress are doing something they're not supposed to be doing, then we as the public, we should demand that they stop and that they be held accountable, because I realize that they're all rich. Most of those people in Congress are very wealthy, and the president is usually fairly wealthy, but there's way more of us than there are of them. The fact that we are a larger part of the population gives us a power that they can't fight against. And, that's why I mean, that's why you currently see a bunch of Republicans getting out of Congress and getting out of politics altogether, because at some point the public, the American public, always demands accountability. And today's American public is way more active because we're way more informed than previous publics, United States public. Okay, so let's get into this list of crises, and it's 2 pages, and it'll take a minute, and that's why I said, you know, you might want to watch this in break it up into parts and watch it. Okay, so the very first one was the executive branch ignoring or challenging court orders. Now, just to give you a reminder, the executive branch is the president and the cabinet, the people who help him. That the president is the executive, president, vice president is the executive branch. Congress, which is made up of the House of Representatives and the Senate, is the legislative branch. And then the judicial branch is the Supreme Court. So the executive branch ignoring or challenging court orders. So the constitutional issue was against Article 3, which is the separation of powers. And the very first one was case was Marbury v. Madison in 1803. The sitting president was Thomas Jefferson. And the outcome of this, when Marbury sued Madison, was the establishment of judicial review, and it was accepted by Thomas Jefferson, by the executive. Now, if you want to know more about these, if some of these sound really interesting, please do feel free to look it up. So the second one for executive branch was Worcester versus Georgia, and that was in 1832, and Andrew Jackson was the sitting president. He ignored a court ruling, a Supreme Court ruling, and that demonstrated the limits of the Supreme Court's enforcement. See, the Supreme Court can say, and they basically did, they told Andrew Jackson that he couldn't do something that he wanted to do, or that he had to do something that he didn't want to do, and he just ignored it. And when someone asked him, President Jackson, the Supreme Court says that, you have to change your behavior in some way, and he said, let them enforce it. Because the Supreme Court doesn't have a police department. It doesn't have any officers that go out and arrest presidents for not doing or for doing, what they shouldn't do. So it really showed the limits of the Supreme Court's enforcement. The enforcement part of the Supreme Court comes from their decisions being considered important enough to listen to and to make changes. And if we don't do that anymore, then the Supreme Court is nothing. Just a bunch of people walking around in black robes. So that's very important, because this is who, the Supreme Court is who we, American citizens, when I say we, I mean American citizens, because we're all American citizens. That's who we depend on to say whether or not something is constitutional. So the next one is the expansion of presidential power. And the constitutional issue is Article 1, checks and balances. And the first one was Youngstown versus Sawyer in 1952, and the sitting president was Harry Truman. And it was a steel seizure that was ruled unconstitutional. I don't know why it underlined that. Okay. Anyway, so Youngstown was so Sawyer, hold on. Sorry, I had someone in my office. So Youngstown versus Sawyer, sitting president was Truman, and Truman seized private steel mills during the Korean War. And it, they were sued. They sued Sawyer, who was the government official who did the actual seizure, and it went on up to the appeals court. So, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the judicial. So when you have a court case like this that's based on the Constitution, you understand, most people understand it eventually is going to end up in front of the Supreme Court, and then they get to decide whether or not they want to look at it. So you take someone to regular court, you sue them for whatever restitution or discontinuation of what they're doing, or to start up what they needed to be doing, and then that usually goes to the regional appeals court, the state level appeals court, and then from there it goes to the Supreme Court, the SCOTUS. So SCOTUS eventually ruled that the steel seizure was ruled unconstitutional because it was against the checks and balances, part of the Constitution. The next one is the United States versus Nixon. Now, Nixon is interesting because that's when I first got interested in politics. Nixon happened in 74, so I was 11 when all this happened. And it just amazed me that a president could get in trouble. I was like, wait, what? The president of the United States can get in trouble? Yeah, if he hadn't have resigned, Nixon would have gone to prison. So he was caught spying. His people were caught spying on the opposition party, and which was the Democrats. Nixon was Republican. I try to stay away from party as much as possible. I usually like to talk about liberal and conservative because we've had so many different, historically we've had a lot of different political parties, and you can't say that. So the Democrats weren't always liberal and they weren't always conservative. It gets to be kind of hinky there, so I try to stay away from that because it's not about party, it's about legality and the Constitution in this particular video. So Nixon had taped a bunch of his phone calls, and he didn't want to release the tapes, and he was forced by Congress to release the tapes, and they were going to impeach him. And we'll talk more about the impeachment process too when we get to that part in the unit in the course. And he resigned before he could be impeached, and Congress did not pursue any legal any kind of legal process because he resigned. So the next one is congressional inaction and weak oversight. And the constitutional issue was Article 1, again, checks and balances. Checks and balances are very important to the way our government works. So the first one was the Teapot Dome scandal. That's for my Downton Abbey fans. If you know, you know. And that was 1921 to 1923. Geez, I'm old. And the sitting president was Warren G. Harding. And it was a congressional investigation that led to convictions. So it's very similar to what is happening now, where people in the government are basically insider trading to make themselves, billions of dollars. And also, buying a lot of stock in companies, and the market, Wall Street gets excited about that, and people start buying that stock also, and then they sell all their stock. So it was something along the lines of that. And it did lead to congressional convictions. The Watergate scandal, again with the checks and balances. Oh, I'm missing a word. I'm missing a letter. Let me put that in there real quick. Again, President Richard Nixon was the sitting president. There were hearings and impeachment proceedings, and he resigned before he could be criminally investigated. Impeachment losing its effectiveness. So the constitutional issue is Article 1, Sections 2 and 3. Andrew Johnson was impeached in 1868, and he was acquitted by one vote. And then the Nixon impeachment process in 1974, he resigned before the final vote, And the way it's written is that it only a sitting president can be impeached. So that's how he got away with being convicted in a court of law and found guilty and jailed. Federal control over elections. This is a big one right now. So constitutional issue, Article 1, Section 4, federalism. And the first one is Bush versus Gore, and the sitting president was Bill Clinton. And this was back in 2000. And there was some not okay, this is Dr. McClellan's opinion. It does not look to me as if there was any intentional um, you know sketchy behavior with the ballots. The big thing was that in Florida they use, because each state runs its own election. The Constitution is completely against the federal government running an election, right? Because that's like the fox watching the hen house. So every state runs its own election. This is all part of federalism. Well, in Florida, they had at this time they had physical ballots, and you pushed a stylus through the hole next to the candidate that you wanted to vote for. And those little flappy pieces, those little pieces were called CHADs, CHADS. And some of them were not completely separated from the paper because it was perforated, the little circles. So think of it like this. It's a Scantron, and you can look up a picture of a Scantron if you've never used one. But instead of filling the hole in with a pencil, you had to push a stylus through the hole that you wanted to choose, and the middle was perforated, and it would pop out. Well, the problem was they didn't work very well, and some of the CHADs did not detach. Some of them just barely detached. And so the Florida Voting Board decided to not count those ballots. And it was enough that it probably would have put Gore as president rather than Bush. And it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looked at it and said, okay, Bush won. And Gore, rather than try to keep pursuing this, Gore said, okay, Bush won. So he conceded the race to you know to the man who became president, President Bush. I believe that was George Bush, the elder. And then the next one, and see, we're getting up to the 2000s now. That doesn't mean we're not going to go back some, but we're getting up to things that are more modern. Arizona versus the Intertribal Council 2013, and the sitting president was Barack Obama, and the federal law was upheld. So in the Arizona versus Intertribal Council, um, Arizona required citizenship, proof of citizenship before you could register to vote and to vote. And the Supreme Court, this again, all of these went up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court ruled that Arizona's law was unconstitutional because even though states run their own elections, especially for president and senator, House of Reps, and all that, the Arizona law went beyond what the federal law did, and so federal law was upheld in this case. The next one, G, is the erosion of voting rights, and the constitutional issue was the 14th and 15th Amendments. And so the Voting Rights Act of 1965, our Texas boy, Lyndon B. Johnson, it expanded voting access. And how it did that is it got rid of things like poll taxes and literacy tests. And then the Shelby County versus Holder, President Barack Obama was the sitting president. So this one, and it's interesting, you'll see, it comes under this one, but it's, gosh, okay, math people, 20, 30, 58 years later, maybe 48 years later. I'm trying to think of how old I was because I was born in '63. I'm trying to think how old I was then. Yeah, about 48 years later. Um, so the Voting Rights Act of 1965 said that basically said that certain states and counties had to get federal permission to change their voting laws, and this was the first time that someone, and it was Shelby County here in Texas, that, um, you know what, I said that, let me check it. Okay, sorry, I had someone in my office, and I had to look up, I had to make sure. I just assumed this was Shelby County. See, everybody needs to look stuff up. Okay, so yeah, this was Shelby County in Texas, and the sitting president was President Barack Obama, and what this ended up doing was it weakened federal oversight. And what Shelby County sued for is that the voting data was 40 years out of um, it was 40 years old, so it was way too old, and um, they made some changes, and then the Fed said you can't do that. The Supreme Court said yes they can. That was old data, and so that weakened federal oversight. So the next one is weak enforcement of Supreme Court decisions. And the constitutional issue is Article 3, rule of law. And the first one was Brown versus Board of Education. Dwight Eisenhower's the sitting president. And the resistance delayed enforcement. Now, Brown versus Board of Education is it's basically the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson. So Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court decision that upheld that, and so of course this was back in the late 1800s, that segregation was constitutional as long as it was separate but equal. And Brown versus Board of Education revisited that and stated that what that Supreme Court decided, almost 100 years later, that almost that separate but equal was not, first of all, it wasn't doable, and second, it was not constitutional. But there was a lot of resistance to the decision of Brown versus the Board of Education, and there was a lot of resistance, not just of the localities, but of the states, and that resistance from the states and the local schools and the local cities and towns delayed that enforcement. And then the next one, again with Eisenhower, is Little Rock Crisis in 1957, and federal troops enforced the ruling there. And this is reason it's also President Eisenhower is this is President Eisenhower called in the National Guard to force segregation on the schools in Little Rock, Arkansas. There's there's quite a few uh, paintings about it and some movies about it, but one of them is um, we especially. You may have actually seen it. It's a fairly widespread. It's a Norman Rockwell painting of two white FBI officers, federal officers, escorting um, just this cute, tiny little black girl, little girl of color, into school. And if you've never seen, if you've never seen the videos from that time frame, um, they're all very disturbing, but they also remind me of what's happening now um, between ICE and Minnesota. So yeah, it's just it's disturbing, but we need to know about this. That we need to know that this is part of government. That friction, even that far, um, that much friction, is necessary for our government to work the way the citizens want it to work. All right, and then we get declining trust in constitutional institutions. And so this is the constitutional issue is popular sovereignty and democratic legacy. Democratic as in democracy, not as in the Democratic Party. So the first one is the election of 1876, and the setting president is Rutherford B. Hayes, and it was resolved by political compromise. So this was a this was a very contested election, probably the most contested election in our history. The candidate who won by just a very, very, very small margin, and the electoral college and the Congress got involved in it, and then what they decided was to pick an alternative president, which was Rutherford B. Hayes. And yes, there is a precedent for that, and there is some. They're not specific instructions, but there are instructions for something like this in the Constitution. But this is the only time we've had to use it. Um, Up here with Al Gore, Bush versus Gore. Al Gore could have taken this same route and possibly um, either gotten a better recount or forced Congress to pick to pick a president. But he decided to not, and he conceded, the race. Now I've got the hiccups. I'm so sorry. And then the last one was Watergate, and that was I can't believe it took it off. That was 1974, and that was um, that was well, trust was partially restored through accountability. I mean, Nixon. You may have actually seen this in some funny skits, or if if you're interested in history. Nixon went to his grave saying, "I am not a crook." There's a real famous picture of him holding up two fingers in V shape, saying, "I'm not a crook." But he was found guilty of spying on the Democrats. So, yeah, and it did partially restore accountability. It partially restored Congress's reputation through accountability, the government's reputation. Except with my stepfather, he felt like that they didn't do enough, and a lot of regular people felt like regular citizens felt like that Nixon was not punished enough, that he was let off. All right, our next section is the unresolved constitutional conflicts of recent and current presidents. All right. Sorry if you can tell that I'm stopping and starting, stopping and starting. It's because I'm in my office hours, and people keep walking in to talk to me, though they can see that I have my headset on. All right, so here's the end of this. Oh God, 30-minute video. It's going to be over 30 minutes. Unresolved constitutional conflicts, recent and current presidents. And the reason that I put this in is because this is what's going to affect you more so than even possibly these things that are already past. That's the deep, distant past for most of y'all. Not for me because I'm old, but these things are important. These unresolved constitutional conflicts are important because they will affect our lives, possibly in some cases the rest of our lives. So unlike the historical examples above, the constitutional conflicts during the Trump and Biden presidencies are still ongoing, or they were recently concluded and do not have yet have clear settled outcomes. So they're not precedents yet. They're some people call them active constitutional conflicts, and some people call them unresolved constitutional conflicts. So um, rather than split Trump's presidency in two, I just went ahead and put it in one. So the key constitutional tensions here are the use of executive power and emergency authority. The Constitution is fairly clear on how someone can use executive power and their emergency authority. So, for example, just because any president signs an executive order doesn't mean it becomes a law. That has to go through Congress. So, see, Congress actually has more power than the president. And when it comes to emergency authority, the president can't declare a war. Um, that has to go through Congress. Conflicts with courts over enforcement rulings. So every time a state court or even an appeals court, a lower level appeals court says, look, President Trump, you have to do thus and so, or you have to stop doing thus and so. He disagrees with it um, unless it's something he likes, and he takes it to the Supreme Court. And, that gets to be a problem after a while. Challenges to election outcomes and democratic norms. Of course, we're all familiar um, with his challenge to the 2020 election, the one he lost. But there were over 60 cases in our courts, in state courts, challenging the election results. And every single one of them, and this includes by Republican appointed judges, not just Democrat judges, Republican appointed judges said, yeah, you have no proof that there was any sketchy business over this election, and they were all thrown out. And then, of course, impeachment is a check on presidential misconduct. Yes, he has been impeached twice, but it didn't go because of the majority of the Republicans in our Congress. They decided to side with Donald Trump, and it was not. There was no legal action taken. And then Joe Biden's presidency also had its unresolved constitutional conflicts. And so his key constitutional tensions: expansion of executive action through agencies. So some of the things that he got done was he used executive action through some agencies to get things changed that he wanted to get done. And that really should go through Congress too. There's a question about it, but it really should. Congress should be on board with it, not just the president and the agencies. And then federal versus state authority on immigration, public health, and elections. And for example, one of the things that Joe Biden did is, and check my numbers, please do. During Joe Biden's presidency, more illegal immigrants were deported from the United States than any other president, including Donald Trump. And sometimes it separated families. And so also, does the federal government, does the federal government's authority take precedent over state authority on immigration and public health and elections? And the public health part is of course the COVID restrictions. And does the federal government have the power to make people get vaccinations, or and wear masks. And then, of course, elections. Some states, some red states, Republican-led states, wanted to change their elections, but they were going above and beyond what's allowed by the federal law. And then judicial review of executive actions. And the one that really has not been tested yet, but it will be, and it will be, in your lifetime, is the Supreme Court basically, clearly, and basically said that the president, any president, now the case happened to be about Donald Trump, but any president, Republican, Democratic, Libertarian, Martian, it doesn't matter. Any president cannot be convicted of a crime, accused and convicted of a crime, if what they're doing is part of their official duties as president. And to the nth degree, really, one of the justices asked Trump's lawyer who presented in front of the court. She said, "Okay, let's take for example the president, any president, sends SEAL Team 6 to kill a political rival. Could that be considered an executive action, an executive duty?" And the lawyer said, "Yes, we see where that could be possible." And it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. So the president can murder people, and as long as they say it's part of their official duties, it's okay. And we've never had a president with that kind of power before. And because the framers were terrified of living under tyranny again, like they did under the British. So, yeah, that's Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton, Adams, Washington, they probably all started spinning in their graves when the Supreme Court decided that, because that is something that they tried horribly. They tried to stay away from that. They thought that was a horrible idea, was anybody not being held accountable for breaking law. That they used the law and the checks and balances and the separation of powers to keep people from, keep presidents from being, tyrants. And this basically opens that door to a president being a tyrant. Any president, when we get into a new timeline, a new multiverse, a new level of the multiverse, there's going to be a president who is not Republican. And this is where the precedent comes in. If a Republican president has gotten away with all kinds of stuff, then the Democratic or the Libertarian or the whatever kind of president can get away with the same stuff. Same thing with the Congress. There's a Republican congressman right now who has been subpoenaed by Congress and refuses to obey the subpoena and has not been punished for it. It's going on years now. So that's precedent. That means that right now we have in Congress we have Republicans, Democrats, and liberals, or independents. Independents. So an independent or Democratic congressman or congressperson, if they get subpoenaed, they can ignore the subpoena. They can take them to court and say, "Look, you're letting that guy get away with it. You can't let one party get away with something and not let the other parties get away with it. That's not how this works. That's not how any of this works. No one has special privileges in the American government, or should have special privileges in the American government. Otherwise, it doesn't work. It becomes, well, it's not a democracy anymore, that's for sure, or a republic." All right, I'm sorry, again, I know this is a really long video, and I suggest you, like in the instructions, that you watch it in increments. And give yourself time to make notes and to think about it, because again, you will be writing about this information on the first exam. All right, If you have any questions, drop me an email, and have a good day.